Okay, so it is recording now. So the way that I approach this with everybody is this way, right? Like, not everybody believes in evolution. I understand that. I do. And I kind of teach this from the idea that the human body did evolve. But I, feel very comfortable sort of telling my students, that like you don't have to believe this, right? You know, for me, as somebody who believes in evolution, I actually think that evolution can still be very helpful to understanding things in this sense. But the reason why I do this way is because when we start to draw the human head, I start to get all these different types of skulls. So like if I put a skull in front of a student and I say draw that skull, often they end up looking like these different evolutionary skulls. And so I think it's really helpful to understand what we are not in order to understand what we are. Okay. So this is Australopithecus afarensis. Does anybody know what the name of this hominid skull is? Like it has another name. It's got a nickname. It's often called Lucy. Okay, this is because Lucy in the Stars, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was playing on the radio when they discovered it. We can see, and this is what I want you to pay attention to as we go through these skulls, the size of the cranium versus the size of the frontal bones. Okay, in particular, the brow ridge here, I want you to focus on how that changes, and I want you to focus on nasal cavity changes, and then also the ear hole. This is your external acoustic medius, the changes to the size of the ear. Okay. So the next one we have is Australopithecus robustus. These are all discovered in Africa. And immediately we can see a major difference between robustus and afarensis, which is the spine on the top of the cranium. So this is the type of spine, y'all, that like gorillas have on the top of their heads. This indicates to us that this hominid had huge jaws because other, primates that have a big spine like that have really large muscles connected to their lower jaw that give them the strength and power to break up all kinds of different types of roots as well as like meats and bones. So we can see here, like look at the height of the cranium here versus the height of the brow ridge. It's not very high. And so we can see that the cranium itself is not too large. So as we go through, what you're going to kind of see is the changes between the size of the jaws to the size of the cranium. And this, of course, indicates the change of the functionality of the brain. The larger the brain, the more it's thinking about hunting and gathering. And then, of course, with the invention of fire and cooked meats and group hunting, there's more meat accessibility, and the hominid changes from like a scavenger to an organized hunter. And so that requires a larger brain, and it requires smaller jaws. So here, this is Boise. I think Boise's a tremendous creature. Look at the size of those cheekbones. This is cheekbones that can, this is cheekbones for days right there, right? And that again indicates very large muscles attached to those cheekbones to help function these large jaws. Quite small eyes, quite large nose, like a smooth transition from the brow ridge into the top of the cranium. Again, we have that spine across the top of the cranium there, which indicates again like those large jaw muscles. Homo habilis is like the first within our species, and basically just means Homo habilis is a tool maker. So we can see smaller brow ridge, nasal cavity still quite large, The zygomatic bones, the cheekbones have diminished in size. The cranium is enlarging. Homo erectus is upright man. Man here being used in like that traditional sense for human. We can see a diminish of the size of the brow ridge right here. We can see that the spine on the top of the cranium has gone. We see an enlargement of the zygomatic in terms of like it's a similar size to the jaw. It feels a bit more similar. And then also we can see that the maxilla and the mandible, maxilla being the top part of the jaw and the mandible being the bottom, are kind of in this region here, similar in size. There's the cranium. We can see a large cranium, kind of equal in size to the jaws, versus as you saw with like Boise or Afarensis, a much smaller cranium. Now, Homo sapiens neanderthalis is a different species in terms of like the classic view of the Neanderthal being like walking around with their club on their shoulder, living in caves. We know that's not true. We know that they had culture. We know that they took care of their elders. We know that they had forms of medicine and oral communication. And we know that they were on the earth for a heck of a lot longer than we've been here. They were mostly found throughout sort of like Europe and Africa, but we do know that they also were in other parts of the globe, like Asia. And this is our closest relative, and most of us have some Neanderthal DNA in some form. We think there's two ideas about how they were removed from the earth. The first being that we hunted them to extinction, and the second being that we mated with them in terms of Homo sapiens. Now we can see they had a really large brain, a very prominent brow ridge, and then they also had very large nasal cavities. And one of the theories about one of the things that may have helped wipe them out was the size of their sinuses, that they would get really easy sinus infections. We can see that their cheekbones have diminished in size, but again, that really large cranium is really important. Now, just recently, I'm going to try to exit out of this. Exit full screen. Just recently, they've added another species, or another member of our species. This is Homo longi. This is just recently added, like first published about like 2 or 3 years ago. And they're not sure if it's an entire, subspecies Homo longi, or if it's Denisovans, which is a group that they know existed, but they have no physical skulls of. So this skull is called the dragon skull. It was discovered near the Dragon River in China. And the worker who discovered it hid it in a well for like 33 years. And then they recently, right before their death, they shared the location of the skull that they had been protecting in this well. And it's extremely well preserved. And there hasn't ever been anything like it discovered before. Brain size is 7 times larger than us. So this species had, their brain was 7 times larger than our brain. And so this is what they are starting to wonder if this is actually either this is the result of Homo sapiens like mating with Neanderthal, and this was part of it, or this is an entirely different, previously unknown hominid, which I think is really cool. I couldn't get that into my PDF because I couldn't figure out how to do that. But it's in the PowerPoint. And I don't know a whole ton about that's that hominid at this time. Okay, so back to this. So then when we get to like us, right, we can see that for the most part, the prominent brow ridge has been removed. Our cheeks have diminished in size. Our mandible and maxilla are similar in proportion. We can see that the cranium is quite large in comparison to the frontal bones. And we no longer have any type of spine or process, which is like a protrusion from the top of our cranium. If you've ever held like an actual real human skull, parts of the skull are like paper thin. And it's incredibly light comparative to what we used to get. Like we really get used to holding a plastic skull. And so we think it has a lot of weight, but an actual human skull is actually quite light. We can see that comparatively between like this and like Australopithecus, we can see the change in the frontal bone size versus the cranium size. Australopithecus, afarensis, and Boise both had very large frontal bones and very small cranium, and we have the opposite almost, right? We're pretty similar, but the cranium takes up a lot of space here. So I always like to kind of show because like, typically we get used to drawing adults, but there are children. I just did some portraits of children for, it helped. I don't usually do portraits of children because parents are very difficult to please. But I just did some portraits of children, and children are really hard to draw and paint. So these are different, skulls from different periods of gestation, coming from like 13 weeks, 20 weeks, 17 weeks, all the way up to like 40 and a half weeks. Now, what's good about this is like it shows us like you actually, like your skull actually has more bones in it when you're born than when you die. And that's not just like your teeth. Your cranium has more bones, and some of your frontal bones have more bones as well. So what's cool about the fetus skull is like the size of this huge brain versus like the little frontal bones, and of course the absence of teeth kind of like crushes all of that down together. So we can see from the top of the fetal skull, we can see that the sutura, which runs right through the middle, right, is very much unsolidified. This is fully ossified on the adult skull and fully solid. Okay, but on the fetal skull, we can see that it's separated. This allows I kind of think about the parietal bones and the frontal bones as kind of being like tectonic plates. And this allows those bones to kind of like slide over one another during birth. So we can see when the baby is born that the two halves of the frontal bone are separated by a sutura, which solidifies and ossifies. And then the mandible is still separated by a sutura down the middle, which later on ossifies through ossification. And then the orbital sockets for the eyes are very large. So the mastoid process is completely absent on a fetus skull. The mastoid process is located right behind your ear, right here. The reason that it's absent is because the way that forms is that the sternomastoid muscle, which connects your head to your chest, it runs down the outside of your neck, pulls on that mastoid process, and that pulling is what makes the mastoid process a bone that protrudes out. The styloid process is completely absent. The styloid process is connected to your tongue. The superciliary arches, which is the brow bones, are not developed, and the glabella, which is the bone between your arches, the frontal bone, is not developed. So basically what's happening, right, is that ossification takes place over many years. Prior to that, it's all like connected with fibrous tissue or cartilage. So the occipital bone has 4 parts to it. The mandible is in 2 halves, and the frontal bone is in 2 halves. So those things all join together. Usually obliteration, which is the complete joining of all the bones, is finished by the age of 40. But like your skeleton is still ossifying and changing into like your mid-20s. So you're actually born with more bones than you have when you die. If you die as an adult, pardon me, but you know, if you make it through adulthood, you die with less bones than you were born with. Okay. So the purpose of all this is because it allows the skull to pass through the birth canal, so that it can be, you know, so this large cranium, large brained being can pass through the birth canal. So this is a interesting painting, and it's by Paul Kane, and it's actually of a Native American from the Pacific Northwest region. And this shows us how skull stretching would have been done. When the baby's skull is soft, it can be manipulated and stretched and shaped. And so this is an indication of what that process looked like. And then we have an indication here over here of what a skull from that period, that practice, the form it took. So we know that this practice was practiced throughout the world in many different cultures. So just quickly to run through all the different bones with you. So your frontal bone is your forehead. You can see it goes through the superciliary arches, which is the top of the eye sockets, all the way into the center of the nose, which is the glabella here. Lateral bone is inside the eye socket and on the side of the nose. It's a very small bone right here. And it touches with the sphenoid bone, which is a really large bone. That's the back of the eye socket, and it also extends through the back of the head. The nasal bone is the top part of your nose. And then your vomer is the middle, which we often speak of as the septum. Your maxilla is a really large bone. Often everyone thinks that the maxilla kind of goes through here, like that, but it doesn't. It goes all the way up the nose and into the eye socket in here. So this sutura here is what you want to look for to differentiate between the zygomatic and the maxilla. So you can think of these sutras, the cracks, as like, those are like landmarks to remember, so that you can think of them as that's the separation between the different bones. So those can help guide you to discover where the bones are. Clear all drawings, annotate off. The zygomatic is part of your cheekbone here, connects to the outside of the orbital socket for the eye. And then the zygomatic arch is on the side. Your mandible is the bottom of your jaw. And then sometimes this doesn't work, but let me see if it works. Hold on, I think I have to make it from a different share. Sorry. Preview, Keynote. Is it still here? Yeah. So this is your temporal mandibular joint while you chew. I always thought this was really cool. So that's the jaw that as you get older, you're going to get, you know, clicking and clacking in. And it's really amazing how it drops down and then turns and then clocks, you know, drops back into place. So that's the origins of TMJ. Sorry. Preview. Okay. Your hyoid bone is in your neck. They actually don't really know what it does. I think that's amazing that they're still kind of like, we think it does this, but we're not totally sure. This is going to be your, I can't see the name because it's covered.
You're muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you. So did you hear that thing? You didn't hear me say that, did you? You did. Okay, so the hyoid bone, we don't really know what it does. The styloid process is connected to your tongue. And then the mastoid process is, again, part of that sternomastoid muscle. So the way these processes are made, it's really cool, right? Like, is that like something is pulling on the bone when it's soft, something attached, and it stretches the bone. I just think that's cool. The occipital bone is in the back of the head. And temporal regional, the temporal foci region right here. Parietal bones are at the top left and right sides of the cranium. And then we go down the spine. The spine is really interesting and important because the spine has, it's a very beautifully balanced thing. The spine has multiple curves to it. It has, the cervical curve. And then, pardon me, I just did that backwards. It has the cervical curve, then thoracic, lumbar, sacrum to coccyx, right? And it's this like relationship between like these curves that help to hold the head up. If there weren't these curves, the head would be either forward or back. And so, whenever I think about posture, because I have problems with my hands, and a lot of it comes from my posture. I remind myself to like think about my posture because, like I sort of say, that took nature millions of years to perfect. I shouldn't, not give nature her props and pull my shoulders up and push my neck down, which we all do, right? Because we get tired. But that balance is really important, and it's something to look for when drawing the figure. So you have 7 vertical vertebrae. Those are the bones in your neck. Your top 2 are your atlas and axis. The atlas is the top one. It holds up the earth, or in this case, holds up the head. The axis allows the head to move up and down. I think I have a slide of that. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Each thoracic vertebrae is connected to a rib. 5 lumbar vertebrae. Those are the widest and strongest vertebrae that you have. And then you have your pelvis, right? And the pelvis is going to be made from the ilium, which is the top bone, and then the ischium, which is the bottom bone. And then you have your coccyx and your sacrum, and those are actually fused together vertebrae. Your coccyx, of course, is your tailbone, and your sacrum is the back of the pelvis. Okay, so that's just like a kind of like a very quick sort of like basic sort of presentation on the skull and on the different vertebrae. Okay, so the only 2 vertebrae that have names are the top 2 of the cervical vertebrae, and that is your atlas and axis. Every night when you go to sleep, you're shorter than when you wake up, because between each vertebrae is a disc, and they squish throughout the day, and then when you go to sleep, they regenerate until you get to a certain age. That no longer happens. But technically, I always thought that was really, really cool. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.